Welcome to the Reality Taboo. It's June 29th. I'll be flying solo now and for the foreseeable future. Jeff was called back to Winters by Dr. Andonuts. There's work that I can't quite understand that he's compelled to take part in. And so in the interim, Ness will be going alone. It wasn't easy, but he made it through Peaceful Rest Valley. And we have to have confidence that he'll figure out a way to beat bosses without multi-bottle rockets. And sometime in the future, presumably to defeat Gygas, he's going to need someone to pray for him, pray with him. But we'll cross those phase-distorting bridges when we get to them. In the meantime, let's get into it, because there's a lot to get into. As the saying goes, sometimes it takes years for anything to happen, and sometimes, in the span of a week, years happen. And this past week has more closely resembled the latter iteration of that expression than the former. Julian Assange is ostensibly a free man, and no one on the planet is more deserving than he. That after 15 years of rotting, he was permitted by the security state to see his wife and children and walk outdoors and get fresh air and synthesize vitamin D, indicates that the American empire isn't just losing soft power in the eyes of its adversaries, but also in the eyes of its allies. The Australian public has been pretty fed up for some time by Julian Assange's perpetual incarceration, but that didn't matter to a silver-tier vassal state of the American empire. The perceived consequences of crossing the security state, the American security state, felt like it was too daunting and too consequential to yield to public pressure. But that appears to be changing now in the face of the American empires losing in Ukraine, losing in Israel, apparently wanting to lose in Taiwan, and that Israeli front is rapidly expanding with the Israeli military not just provoking the wider Arab world by what has taken place in Gaza and increasingly again in the West Bank, with more Palestinians being forced out to make room for additional Israeli settlers, while in the north, Israel makes incursions into Lebanon proper to go after various Hezbollah targets. An American empire that couldn't make an orderly withdrawal from Afghanistan is now contending with the prospect of a three-front war, each front of which will involve forces that are much, much more able to get kinetic in a serious way than anything that happened in Afghanistan. And so I think that is the global realpolitics insight into making sense of why Assange was released. He was a happy beneficiary of a shifting global chessboard. And one aspect of Assange's release that hasn't received a lot of attention, at least from the sympathetic sources that are celebrating his release, and understandably so, given what he's been through and what he has done in terms of revealing the true nature of the American empire. What I haven't seen much covered is part of this plea deal that he has agreed to forbids him from releasing any more of the emails that he has obtained and that WikiLeaks is presumably in possession of now. That teases a little bit of something we'll be mentioning here in a bit about the possibility of Joe Biden being replaced as the Democratic nominee and potentially Hillary Clinton being plugged in at the top of the ticket in place of Joe Biden as a compromise to snub Kamala Harris, but not as brutally as snubbing her with a photogenic white man like Gavin Newsom would be. It would be very inconvenient, to put it mildly, for WikiLeaks to release additional information related to Hillary Clinton's emails that were released in 2015 and caused a lot of headache for the Clinton campaign, not just in the general election, but also in the primary season against Bernie Sanders, who, in one of his many instances of genuflecting in front of the institutional power structure, as his supporters and his surrogates were harping on the corruption that was exposed by her tens of thousands of emails that were released by WikiLeaks, as they were clamoring for more to be made of that corruption, Bernie Sanders on multiple occasions downplayed the significance of the emails and said at debates that he didn't want to hear about it anymore, that he wasn't interested in putting pressure on it because it wasn't important. It was just a distraction, something that an amateur Freudian could have a field day with. The idea of projection, that Bernie Sanders saying that Hillary Clinton's corrupt emails being released was a distraction was actually channeling the fact that his candidacy and his brand of social democratic European style politics that had a lot of purchase among a significant portion of the left side of the American political spectrum, broadly speaking, that his candidacy was a distraction designed to keep that portion of the left on side and to guarantee that as they rallied behind him and he rallied behind the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, the establishment, the institutional power, that they would follow and that they would guarantee that that institutional power structure remained unchallenged by the dirtbag left. And up until the last couple of months, with the conflagration in Israel and the consequent fallout in America with some of the elements of that said dirtbag left reemerging in a very salient way, protesting on college campuses and in power centers in front of Democratic fundraising events and the like, that distraction had proved quite effective. As has been stressed here before, though, I think it is important not to overdo the emphasis on the opposition to the Uniparty's top priorities, one of which is, of course, the state of Israel, and that was laid bare in the primary that happened in New York's 16th district's primary results. It's a safe blue district where the primary is effectively the general election, and Jamal Bowman was heavily attacked by AIPAC, by the Israel lobby, on account of his perceived insufficient loyalty to Israel. The guy who beat Bowman, George Latimer, is a white man who replaced a black man. I don't know if Latimer is Jewish. I can't find a definitive answer one way or the other, but he is certainly backed by a lot of powerful and deep-pocketed Jewish organizations, and at the risk of repeating myself, by the power structure more generally. And so it's another reminder that in the internecine struggle on the left, that the Palestinian side really is the weak horse. The anti-Israel elements of the establishment are embarrassing, but they are being systematically rooted out and simultaneously beaten outright in head-to-head competition, as this primary race demonstrated. And no amount of intersectionality points are enough to overcome that. Not even close. The objection to that analysis might be Thomas Massie, who AIPAC also spent several $1 million attempting to primary earlier this year, and it was a spectacular failure electorally. But I don't think that's as inherently contradictory an analysis as it might appear at first blush. To a significant extent, the power structure is comfortable with the enemy, the Goldstein hate object, to put it in Orwellian terms, to nominally be on the right, the populist right. So the callous Thomas Massie, the libertarian, capitalist in opposition to the welfare state, or the bigoted and nativist type archetype, Paul Gosar in Arizona. Those are the faces of opposition that the ruling establishment prefers to have as a unifying force for the rest of the population to turn its acrimony towards someone like Jamal Bowman, who is on the left and is ostensibly a progressive cultural revolutionary. That is not the public face of opposition that the regime prefers to have as one of the primary adversaries. And so for appearances, of course, Massey and Gozar and people like him who have very little influence on how the major parties operate still have to be opposed. And in some ways that opposition and the ineffective opposition, at least in terms of electoral results, feeds the idea of something that psychologically is important to many people, and that is the idea that it's a David versus Goliath struggle, and despite all objective outward appearances, they perceive themselves as the David fighting the Goliath. And so having a loss here and there helps shore up that self-conception that they are actually fighting the power structure when they're going up against people like Thomas Massey from Nowheresville, flyover, middle America, Kentucky, hillbilly country, or as he refers to himself as an Appalachian American. The idea that they gave a good fight, but they didn't win this battle, is in a lot of ways invigorating. It's a source of motivation for them. The fight isn't over. The fight is never over. The struggle is perpetual. Revolution is perpetual, even as the world they live in looks nothing at all like the world that a Thomas Massey would want to create, and looks far, far more like the world that the laptop set of Manhattanites that are their neighbors, that they never talk to in person, even though they live in the same apartment building, but that they do share the social media posts of regularly with single sentence captions like this, period. Even though the world, and certainly the aspiring zeitgeist, far more resembles the world that they inhabit, holds the whip hand politically and culturally. On the other hand, and dovetailing somewhat with the earlier look at Australia being given more deference than a vassal state normally is of the American empire, at least until recently, the foxes may be feeling more forced to be lions, or try to be lions, than they're comfortable with. It's impossible to talk about Thomas Massey now without mentioning the mysterious death of his wife this week. He hasn't publicly suggested foul play, but he has kids, and so maybe he wouldn't. It is curious that he mentioned that his wife was with him when he visited Tucker Carlson in rural Maine just a few weeks ago. How much of his personal life he would share to the public is something I'm no more privy to than anyone else on the outside looking in would be. But a healthy, intelligent, industrious woman living an active lifestyle on the Massey homestead, for her to spontaneously drop dead, seemingly without any warning ahead of time, no advance notice, for her to die in the wake of her husband's very public battle with AIPAC, and one that he came out appearing to get the better of AIPAC. For his wife to suddenly turn up dead is very peculiar and very curious. Speaking of Tucker Carlson, on a less macabre note, Steve Saylor was interviewed by Tucker Carlson this week. Man, is that a long time coming. In another life, I would have been typing into the void if it weren't for him. No person did more to signal boost that previous iteration of Ness than he did. And so on a personal level, and one that doesn't matter or shouldn't matter beyond a level of self-indulgence that I will engage in here for a second, on a personal level, I'm tremendously happy for him to get the recognition he deserves. He really missed the mark on COVID, and in a lot of ways it seems that the Cultural Revolution has moved too fast for him to reorient himself to. In the same way Pat Buchanan comes in for criticism for thinking that it's always 1950s Washington, D.C., Saylor might be critiqued for thinking that it's always the 1980s or 1990s in California, and the reasonable, moderate appeals he is making are being made to a regime that no longer exists, if it ever did to begin with. More magnanimously, Steve Saylor has always self-described himself as an observer, a noticer, a historian of the present, not a prognosticator of the future, and not a master tactician operating 3 steps ahead of the forces of darkness.
Faced with tragedy, even observers need to take action.
To Ferry's prodding aside, that doesn't appear to be in Steve Saylor's constitution. That said, the lifting of his persona non grata status on the right could, more optimistically, be taken as evidence of the elite theory we've referenced on multiple occasions here on the Reality Taboo in action. After all, it's always the elites that Steve Saylor has been aiming his influence at. Don't let the accessibility and humility of his writing style lead you to believe otherwise. It's apparently a poorly kept secret that the opinion makers and cultural shapers all read him, but none would ever admit to as much. My guess is that is a bit aggrandized. I suspect that it applies to a small slice of the commentariat that has a dissident streak in them, but that characterizes a small sliver of the elites in positions of power and authority, where status considerations are what matter and are all that matter, and that the truth, the unspeakable truths in particular, those forbidden truths that if they were uttered or if it were even known that you were interested in finding out about them, that curiosity could lead to a drastic drop in your status, and yet you follow his prolific output nonetheless. I just don't see it. But Tucker has spotlighted him. That means Elon Musk has been made aware of him. If he wasn't already, Elon Musk's brother, Kimball, has had some dalliances, allegedly, with ideas widely discussed on the dissident right. And so it's certainly not inconceivable that Elon Musk's power level is higher than he has let on, even after becoming the owner of Twitter. So it's not entirely implausible. Unlikely, I'd say. Highly unlikely, but not entirely implausible that Steve Saylor and many of his acolytes in what used to be referred to as the Stevosphere back in the aughts and early teens, that he becomes part of the intelligentsia of an elite insurgency led by the Bill Ackmans and the Elon Musks of the world. Despite a venerable and impressive 20 years on the lists of the SPLC's and the ADL's worst people in America, despite that, Steve Saylor has always been reliably more pro-Jewish and less hostile towards Jews and Zionism. And I'm not necessarily lumping those two together. Of course, there is overlap, but they're not synonymous. He's been more pro-Jewish and pro-Zionist and less hostile to Jews and less hostile to Zionism by a significant factor than the majority of his readers are. I suspect that's just disposition, but it could be something more strategic, something more tactical, and something that is paying real dividends for him now. And if that is the case, I think he's played the game right. I think that is the path forward, if there is one. If you can't beat them, then you join them. And that can be true of both Heritage America and elite Zionist American Jews. They find themselves in a landscape where neither can survive on their own, but in coalition are able to mutually prosper. Turning now to what the conventional wisdom would identify as the singularly most newsworthy and important event of the past week, the presidential debate between Biden and Trump. Following Biden's senescence symposium, the betting markets have seen Biden's general election chances cut in half. They've dropped from 50% to 25%. That is of winning the general election. That has primarily come at the expense not of Trump's likelihood of losing. Trump's likelihood of winning inched up a few percentage points to 59%, but the majority of that drop in Biden's perceived chances of smart money chances of winning the presidency came in the form of Kamala Harris's elevated chances and, to a lesser extent, Gavin Newsom getting the nomination. Those two are currently at 25% and 17% respectively. And coming in at the number 4 spot is Hillary Clinton at 6%. For sake of argument, assuming the election is conducted in a free and fair way and the real results of the election manifest in a way that matters, if they manifest at all, Kamala Harris is perhaps an even greater disaster than Joe Biden is turning out to be. And yet there is no conceivable way that someone like Gavin Newsom gets the nod ahead of Kamala Harris, unless she is cut in on something really big that allows her to feel justified in publicly stepping aside and offering the top of the ticket to him, thereby foregoing her opportunity at the presidency, not just in 2024, but also in 2028, because if Gavin Newsom is at the top of the ticket, even if Kamala Harris remains as VP, that means that in 2028, it's Gavin Newsom again. And though she is the personification of failing upwards, she does move upwards. She has ascended to the top rank of the power structure's public-facing edifice. And the vapidity of everything she's ever said or that anyone's ever heard her say in public aside, no one accumulates that kind of power and influence by being bad at understanding ways to leverage power and influence. And so even though Newsom's name is being thrown around, I still find it highly unlikely, bordering on inconceivable, that he gets the nomination. Hillary Clinton, on the other hand, has a stronger claim. She's been vying for the position for decades now. When she ran in 2008, she was the presumed frontrunner. And when she ran again in 2016, she was again the presumed frontrunner. And as much as Donald Trump surely wants to get revenge on the humiliation of losing to Joe Biden in 2020, you can be sure Hillary Clinton's desire for vengeance for 2016 is stronger still. She could step in with Kamala Harris keeping the VP spot without it unavoidably looking like the upstaging of Harris that a Newsom nomination would. Predictit.org, the betting site that I'm familiar with and that I use for informational purposes and also as a means of making a monetary injection of hopefully smart money of my own, doesn't have Michelle Obama shares listed in its Democratic presidential nominee market. That strikes me as inexplicable, but the yeses come to 100%, so there isn't much smart money on her. If there was, get into the weeds a little bit in terms of how these markets work, the yeses would come up short of 100%, as people would put more money on the no side of things for any of the candidates, starting at the one with the most likely or the highest likelihood of winning on down. And so if you wanted to bet that yes, Michelle Obama would win, but Michelle Obama isn't listed as a share, then you would just bet no on Joe Biden and no on Kamala Harris and no on Gavin Newsom, et cetera, et cetera. You could max out all your no shares on the presumption that the person who is going to end up getting the nomination isn't even listed. And the way that the betting market rules work, that if everyone listed there doesn't win, then all the no's resolve the winners, and everyone who bet no against any of the candidates gets some payout, and everyone who voted for any of the candidates of a yes does not get any payout at all, and there is no yes payout for any of the shares. That can happen, but before that happens, it causes a distortion in the yes-no balance, but that distortion isn't there. Effectively, it's not there at all. Depending on how it's rounded, it might be at 1%, but man, it sure feels higher than a 1% chance to me that Michelle Obama wins, especially in light of a YouGov Economist poll that came out this week that asked about the favorability of several prominent political figures in the United States, and topping the list by a wide margin was Barack Obama. Obama has a plus 12 favorability rating, including a plus 11 rating among independents. By comparison, Donald Trump has a negative 18 rating among the general public and also among independents, and Joe Biden a negative 19 rating among the general public and a staggering negative 31 among independents. And that favorability rating is simply calculated by taking the percentages who view these different officials as favorable and subtracting from that the percentages who view them as unfavorable. Kamala Harris, -17. Mike Johnson, -13. Mitch McConnell, -48. Boy, does that make my heart sing, because there really is no better personification of the corruption and decay and rot at the heart of the late-stage American empire than somebody like Mitch McConnell. Chuck Schumer also comes in at -19. Hakeem Jeffries comes in at a relatively more respectable -8. But we can see all these, those are all of the political figures that the YouGov Economist survey asks about, and they are all in significantly negative territory except for Barack Obama, who is not just in positive territory, but in double-digit positive territory. And presumably a lot of the affinity for Barack Obama would carry over to Michelle Obama were she to run. In 2008, of course, Obama famously ginned up an enormous amount of support among younger voters, a demographic that the current iteration of the Democratic Party is struggling mightily with, especially in comparison to what Obama did in 2008 and to a lesser extent in 2012 with younger voters. Citing that same YouGov Economist poll, just 23% of those under the age of 30, so Zoomers, effectively report being extremely or very enthusiastic about voting in the presidential election in November. That compares to 68% of those over the age of 65. So more than 3 times as many boomers report being enthusiastic to vote in November as do Zoomers. Now, whether Barack Obama still has that magic that he had 15 years ago to attract young voter support, and if he does, whether or not that support will extend to Michelle Obama if she's running, given how much less charismatic and less intelligent and less compelling she is than he is an open question, but it's hard to imagine that it would be worse than whatever Joe Biden is doing for young voters at the moment. I do apologize. I mentioned the candidates that were assessed by the YouGov Economist poll, but I didn't mention RFK's. I'd intended to come back to that and just it slipped my mind momentarily, but we'll get back to that right now. RFK, Robert Kennedy, also has a net favorability that is significantly negative at -14, and more worrisome for RFK than any of the other figures mentioned is how his favorability is in negative territory across the partisan spectrum. So among Democrats, he has a negative favorability of 32, among independents of -6, and among Republicans of just -2. So he has more enemies than friends everywhere. And parenthetically, this reveals how absurd the idea that RFK is going to be given the Democratic nomination is. Democrats despise him. There's just no way that that's going to happen. Moving away from the news cycle into a more perennial question that didn't make news in the same way this week that a lot of the other events that we've referenced up to this point had, but in our own little universe, it was relevant as happening within the last week because we mentioned it in previous week's podcast, and that is the hilarious interrogation of a gay rights activist somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. She didn't provide much of an interesting answer to the question, but it is an interesting question. Being born that way, that used to be the zeitgeist's answer, but the alphabet avalanche has rhetorically wrecked that. You can be gay today, but decide that you're trans tomorrow, and that is no one's right to question or dispute. That's how it sits in the current zeitgeist. But that obviously doesn't mesh with the idea that one is born that way. If you're born that way, if you're born gay, well then tomorrow you're not going to suddenly realize, no, you're not a gay man, you're actually a woman who is attracted to men, and therefore you are a transgender heterosexual. In the previous iteration of the conventional wisdom that gay people were born that way is the more accurate one. It does not follow, however, that just because someone is born gay means that there is some genetic underpinning for homosexuality. Quite the contrary, there's almost no condition other than infertility or some other kind of terrible medical condition that leads to prepubescent death like trisomy 13 that is worse for reproductive fitness than homosexuality. And so the idea that it's a genetic trait makes no sense in the Darwinian framework. Gay people don't reproduce, and so gay genes don't either. And as an interesting aside on that, prior to homosexuality's mainstream acceptance, homosexual reproductive fitness was surely higher than it is today. The Oscar Wildes of the world 2 centuries ago had a family and had their own biological children and lived an alternate life on the DL. But the toleration and now celebration of homosexuality has allowed them to skip bath time entirely and instead spend all their time in the bathhouses. So if it's not genetic, but it's not chosen, it's not cultural, and I think that especially applies with male homosexuality. I think female homosexuality is a different issue almost entirely. Female sexuality appears to exist on much more of a spectrum, whereas male sexuality tends to be quite binary, with those who claim to be bisexual, who are men, almost always being effectively homosexual. Well, if it's not genetic and it's not chosen, then what is it? My best guess is that it is the result of some sort of in utero infection that's more popularly referred to as the gay germ theory. The idea that it is the result of some sort of infection that causes the sexual orientation wires to get crossed. And if that is accurate, it raises an interesting question, potentially the future, if there might be a, quote, cure, unquote, for homosexuality. Would gays take it? My guess is to a large extent probably no, but I do suspect that most parents, were they able to, or expecting parents, were they able to ensure that their children, their offspring, would not be gay, would they opt for that certainty that their children would not be gay? I think yes, overwhelmingly they would. And finally, reclining back to news of the week, there has been recent congressional action attempting to require all women upon turning 18 to register for the draft in the United States. Martial prowess is not something women are built for, obviously, and they are the least expendable resource of a society, particularly fertile women. No society with its head screwed on straight allows its fertile women to engage in combat. This is something the Romans understood 2,000 years ago when they mocked the barbarian Celts and Goths for allegedly having female warriors that they would send into battle. The implication was quite obviously that their societies, to the extent that you could call those barbarians groups societies at all, that they were inferior to and less healthy than Roman society. You don't throw away your most valuable resource, and fertile women are, again, the society's most valuable resource. Men and the elderly of both sexes are more expendable. Run through a simple thought experiment. There are 50 people marooned on a remote island somewhere in the Pacific a millennia ago. If those 50 consisted of 2 men and 48 women, the society has a bright future, because the men, just the couple of men are there, they can impregnate all of the women, and in a generation, that island's population could explode and continue to grow until it bumped up against the carrying capacity of the island itself. But if that shipwrecked population consisted of 48 men and 2 women, as it more likely would have done a millennia in the past for seafaring expeditions, it was toast. Those 2 women, even if all the pregnancies went well, couldn't possibly procreate enough to come close to replenishing the population of 50 that the marooned society began with. Put another way, the ultimate human resource is humans, and women are the limiting factor on the rate of reproduction. The more women you have, the more people you have a generation down the line. Just adding men to the equation without a corresponding number of women, in contrast, does nothing to secure the future population of a society, which is why it is often excess men who go out to capture women from other societies, revealing from another angle how pre-menopausal women are the least expendable and thus most valuable segment of a society. And so from the perspective of whether or not it's socially salubrious to include women in the draft, no, of course it's not in a perverse way. That's why I welcome it. It's perfectly indicative, fittingly so, of a depleted, dying society, and one that unfortunately needs to die so that something else better might rise from its ashes. More practically speaking, modern Westerners won't lift a finger for anything other than the ability not to be forced to lift a finger. Comfort is king in the modern Western world. A draft for World War III against BRICS with the Western nations, with only men being called up, it would at this point go probably worse than it's going in Ukraine, where they're effectively capturing and impressing into military service men in their 40s and 50s. And that's among a much poorer population, and one that largely hates the population that they're going to fight against. None of those factors don't port at all into the Western world. Despite the power structure's best efforts, there's nothing like the visceral hatred for Russians among Americans that there are among Ukrainians. And Americans have far more in the way of creature comforts to give up if it comes time to suit up and ship out to the other side of the world to force same-sex marriage and drag shows in the Caucasus and on China. And then on top of that, as unpopular as a draft would be right now, with just men being drafted, you tell Americans that their wives and daughters are going to have to go fight for these things. You want to find out if Molon Labe has any teeth? Well, that's the way that you would do it. All right, I'll wrap up the potpourri there and talk to you next week.